Dear Bishop Hicks, brother deacons, you, my friends, who form this Cathedral parish community, dear brothers and sisters from the Diocese of Joliet and beyond who have tuned in to pray with us, good evening, and thank you for letting me preach to you on this holy and important night. This is my third year as a priest, and it's my third year preaching at Holy Thursday. And you, Bishop Hicks, are my third bishop for Holy Thursday Mass. Bishop Hicks was one of my teachers in the seminary, and we've mutually agreed to forget that time. The first year I preached to you, we preached about the Eucharist. Last year I preached about the priesthood. And this year, I want to preach about you and me. As a lot of you know, last May, I finished a master's degree in Catholic Studies from the University of St. Thomas. Catholic Studies asks the question, what is the impact of the incarnation of Jesus on human thought and culture? What does God becoming a human mean for humanity in all of its expressions? I'm so grateful to have had the chance to study and to explore the rich Catholic tradition, philosophy, theology, art, science, education, the other humanities, but my favorite is literature. I never thought that I would have the excuse to read the great literary classics of our tradition. But during one semester, I was able to take a class devoted entirely to Dante's Divine Comedy. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this masterpiece of Christian writing, its author, Dante Alighieri, presents an autobiographical analysis of his own life through the lens of his own spiritual awakening. Through his 3 books, he is led through hell, purgatory, and ultimately reveals his vision of paradise. Dante began writing in 1308, and this long-form poem is considered to be the most famous piece of Italian literature ever written. The Divine Comedy, by the way, is where we get that beautiful image, that interesting image of the 9 circles of hell. Dante begins the first book, Inferno, with this incredible line. In the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. Dante wrote in his journal that he experienced that moment of awakening on Holy Thursday in the year 1300. Until that night, Dante freely admits that he had lost the way to salvation and that he had begun to descend into a life of sin and that he was afraid of falling into what he called the low place where the sun is silent. But eventually, Dante is rescued by the Roman poet Virgil, who teaches him that in order to achieve the freedom that he desires, he must empty himself and make the decision to move forward on the path set before him, to continue with courage, moving through the dark wood as he travels downward through each circle of hell. And Dante learns in those whom he encounters that he himself will be forced to reckon with his own sins. So after descending through the levels of the Inferno, and after writing literally hundreds of pages, Dante arrives in the pit at the very center of hell. Now, contrary to the popular image, Dante describes the very center and core of hell not as a fiery furnace, but as a frozen lake. And stuck in the middle of the lake, frozen in one place forever, is the devil himself. He sees that the devil has 6 massive wings, since the tradition says that before the angels fell, Lucifer belonged to the order of the seraphim. He flaps his wings with great vigor, trying to escape, but the more he flaps, the more he spreads the cold air around and solidifies his place in the ice. The devil now has 3 heads, which for Dante represents a disgusting perversion of the Trinity. For the devil is impotent, ignorant, and full of hate. But God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. In each of his 3 mouths is found one of the greatest traitors in history, Brutus and Cassius, who betrayed Julius Caesar, and of course, in the worst position of all, is Judas Iscariot. Dante hates what he sees and what it does to him. He writes that everything is suddenly shrouded in a mist, completely dark. He says, "How then I became frozen and feeble, do not ask, dear reader, for I do not write it. But all speech would be insufficient. I did not die, and I did not remain alive. Think now for yourself what I became." Dante and Virgil both approach Lucifer, and taking a deep breath, they plunge themselves through the hole in the ice, expecting to find themselves descending. But instead, they notice that they are actually ascending, because they realize that everything in hell, everything that led them away from God, was actually upside down. And now, having passed through it, Dante regains full consciousness and begins to ascend toward heaven. At this point, you are asking yourself, why am I listening to a book report? Because Dante teaches us every lesson that will move us through these days. Tonight, the church invites us to reckon with our own lives, to take ourselves seriously, allowing ourselves to be confronted with the reality of sin, not in some general abstract way, but my sin and your sin, with the reality of the consequences of sin, but also with the reality of redemption, and to see, maybe for the first time, not only what this redemption cost, but also what sort of Redeemer we might be dealing with in the first place. Sin literally upsets the world. Creation is designed to move toward God. He is our origin, He is our end. St. Augustine wrote that we have been made for God, and that our hearts are restless until they rest in Him. Interestingly, the word in Latin that Augustine uses for, you've made us for yourself, is not the word pro, which you know because we say ora pro nobis, pray for us. We weren't created to be God's employees. God did not need to create us in order to become complete. God used the word ad, A-D. Some of you may say that my description of Dante went on ad nauseum, ad infinitum. Ad is the Latin word which means toward. We have been created, Augustine says, toward God. So in the very pit of who we are, it's like a compass which knows due north. Our hearts are restless until they rest in Him, because the heart recognizes the one who designed it, the one who sets it free, and the one to whom it has been longing to return from the very beginning. The heart knows infallibly what corresponds to its longing. And what is the longing of the Christian heart? St. Paul says it so beautifully. I count everything as loss in order that I may gain Christ and be found in Him. Think of that beautiful line that we just heard a few days ago from John's Gospel. Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Remember, though, that living now, as we already do, in the new age initiated by the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, remember that we have already been freed for this kind of fulfillment. And yet, as Pope Francis writes so often, we suffer from a kind of spiritual Alzheimer's, a certain amnesia of the heart. We forget what has happened to us. And we aren't the first ones to have this experience of God. In the book of Exodus, God commands that the Israelites celebrate the Passover at the same time every year. We heard that in the first reading. This month shall stand at the head of your calendar. You shall reckon it the first month of the year. In other words, this month, God says, the month in which I will set you free from slavery to Pharaoh and set you on a new journey to a new homeland, a homeland in which I will live among you. This month will now be for you as if it is the beginning of time. You are recreated in these days, for your slavery is over and a new life has begun. You will keep these events of Passover as a memorial feast, a perpetual institution. You will celebrate them always and for all time, for these are not events which remain in the past. It's as if God says that this saving moment, this liberating action will be carried out throughout all time for my people who remain in my covenant. The promise of liberation, of a homeland, of a new covenant, and of God's perpetual presence, this is some of the most beautiful language in all of the Scriptures. And rightly, it moves us, it strengthens us, it comforts us. And yet tonight, we, like Dante, awaking on Holy Thursday, are in the midst of tumult on every side. We are waking up to the fact that despite this beautiful promise of God, we often find ourselves given over to the disorientation of sin. We wake in the dark wood to the painful reality that our fallen nature sometimes leaves us hurling headlong downward toward death. The Israelites were more than willing to be taken out of Egypt, but allowing Egypt to be taken out of them is a different matter entirely. A different matter that would become their downfall and ours as well. So we have to recognize that the exodus from Egypt is to be kept as a perpetual memorial because, as I have said, the exodus from Egypt is a foreshadowing of our, and tonight I want you to make the transition to say, of my liberation. I can say with confidence that I have been set free. And yet, I'm shameful to say, but I say it also with confidence, that in many ways I yearn to return to Egypt. This is the painful reality with which each one of us must contend tonight. That sin does exist, and it exists in my life. That sin upsets and distorts reality. Sin keeps me bound to a low place, as Dante said. Sin leads me away from God into emptiness. But there is a joyful reality which draws our attention, because as we come to face this emptiness, we are face to face, greeted really, by something and by someone who is very strange. So he rose from supper and took off his outer garments. He took a towel and tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet and dry them with the towel around his waist. What's going on here? Good-natured helpfulness? A readiness to serve? The moment described here is far too huge for any slight motive to explain it entirely. There are people who instinctively seek the lowest place because of an inner uncertainty, maybe, or a feeling of inferiority, which drives them to perform the most menial tasks so that they can achieve a certain kind of inner peace. I'm not worthy of any other place, so I must do this. You call me Master and Lord, Jesus says, and you say, well, for so I am. What is Jesus doing? I want you to recall something else that Paul wrote to the Philippians. Though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at. Rather, he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. Jesus became a human to live our life so that he might penetrate to depths within ourselves that we could never measure. That is, he comes to live our life so that he might die our death. And by dying our death, he enters more fully into our own emptiness than we ever could. And by so doing, he fills our emptiness with the one thing we had been looking for all along, which is the fullness of his own presence, of his own life. Sin upsets the balance of the world, and it creates what for us becomes an unconquerable void. But our salvation was not something that God wanted to bring about with a detached or effortless gesture. Bippity boppity boo, you're redeemed, as he said from his chaise lounge in heaven. God felt the full weight of what redemption required. And so God literally emptied himself, embracing the nothingness of our world of sin, the same nothingness that caused Dante to be alive and not alive at the same time, to abandon himself to the void and to destruction. That is Christ's sacrifice. And this is the meaning of the washing of the feet. The performance of the most menial task, reserved in ancient times for the lowest of slaves, is the fullest and the most beautiful explanation that Jesus ever offered regarding what he was about to accomplish on the cross. All his life, people said, give us signs, give us teachings, explain the parables. And the most concrete, the most thorough explanation he ever gave of what he was going to do on the cross, he accomplished when he knelt down to wash the feet of his friends. In that moment, after the supper in which he instituted the new covenant, in the context of the perpetual memorial, Jesus stooped down into the emptiness. He embraced the humanity and the frailty of his disciples, and he did so, not as a corporate consultant, not as a distant executive, not as a disinterested third party. Jesus entered into their lowliness as their friend. Every Christian, one day or another, reaches the point where they too must be ready to accompany their master into this destruction and oblivion which is found inside of each of us. We are called to enter into that which the world considers folly, that which for my own understanding is totally incomprehensible. Whatever it means, whatever it's going to look like, suffering, dishonor, the loss of loved ones, the shattering of a lifetime's worth of accomplishments, this is the decisive test of our Christianity? Will we shrink back before the ultimate depths, or will we be able to go all the way and thus win our share of the life of Christ? And this is the invitation of Holy Thursday. This is the invitation that Dante heard when, on this night, 721 years ago, he was woken up by the Spirit of Jesus and led from the darkness of sin into the brilliance of life. This is the invitation: to face our own reality, to take it seriously, and to ponder it in silence, and then to move forward into whatever we find, confident that Jesus, by his death, by his resurrection, has already been there and has paved the way. In Jesus, death is conquered and sin is forgiven, and all the emptiness, all the imbalance, all the disorientation is set up right and is fulfilled. When he had washed their feet and put his garments back on and reclined at table again, he said to them, "Do you realize what I have done for you?